600cc sport bikes are some of the most powerful and fun motorcycles you can buy, with bikes such as the Yamaha R6 and Honda CBR 600RR being at the top of their class. So how come 650s and even 700s be slower even though they have a higher displacement capacity? Well, let's find out. The answer to this question is simple and complicated. The simple answer being 600s became one of the most popular engine sizes for sport bikes when they came out in the mid to late 1980s. Back in the day, sport bikes were reserved for the 900cc plus class of motorcycles. However, Kawasaki then released the GPZ 600R back in 1985. It was designed and built to be a smaller version of their then flagship, the GPZ 900R sport bike. This GPZ 600R started the trend when it was released. Shortly after, Yamaha, Honda, then Suzuki all followed suit with their own middleweight sport bikes. As middleweight sport bikes started becoming one of the biggest markets for consumers, the 600cc class became a battleground for the Big Four to see who could make the fastest, similarly to the 1000cc class today. 650s, 700s and 750 class motorcycles have mostly been used in the more comfortable touring-oriented bikes, not to mention that a lot of them only use 2 cylinders rather than the 4 cylinders you see in sport bikes and race bikes. This is where things start to get a little more complicated. To fully understand why 600s are so fast, you need to know the basics of how an engine works. Say you have a 650 with 4 cylinders. A 600 will likely still be quicker, even though the 650 has 50cc more displacement volume to play with. The trick to the 600's power is RPM. 600s can rev up to ridiculously high speeds. 13,000, 14,000 and 15,000 plus RPM are commonplace for 600cc sport bikes. So how on earth can they rev up that high? When an engine cylinder has a mix of fuel and air, a spark plug will then ignite the mixture, which causes a small explosion. The expanding pressure from the explosion pushes down on a piston, which in turn rotates a crankshaft. This rotational force is then transferred to the clutch pack, then the gearbox to the drive chain, which ultimately drives the rear wheel. The width of the cylinder is called the bore, and the distance which the piston drives the crankshaft is called the stroke. These two measurements determine the so-called size of the engine or its displacement, and the max RPM that the engine can achieve. You can increase the engine displacement in 2 ways. The first is by expanding the cylinder downwards and increasing the length of the stroke. The second is by increasing the width of the bore and decreasing the length of the stroke. The way how 600s rev so high is because of the latter. There are loads of different ways a manufacturer can produce more torque. However, 650s and 700s usually have a narrower bore but a longer stroke. This increases the torque of an engine, but limits how fast the engine is able to turn because of the extra mass needed to lengthen the piston and therefore to lengthen the stroke. If an engine like this revs too high, the weight of the reciprocating pistons will wear out the crankshaft and the bearings really quickly, meaning that they're only able to top out around 11 to 12,000 RPM. Otherwise, the engine itself could explode. High revving 600s have the opposite approach. A much shorter stroke means that they're able to spin the crankshaft faster without needing to worry about the stress on the rotational components. But the way how they increase the displacement is by increasing the width of the bore. This effect produces less torque than their 650 counterparts, but when you times the torque by the higher RPMs, the result is more horsepower. For those of you that don't know the difference between torque and horsepower, don't worry, here's a quick explanation. Torque is how much rotational force an engine produces, meaning the physical amount of force an engine can deliver to the rear wheel. Horsepower is the amount of torque over time, or the amount of torque applied over revolutions per minute. So if you have an engine that produces lower torque but spins faster, this means that it's able to apply the maximum torque to the ground more times. That's horsepower. Horsepower is calculated as torque times RPM divided by 5,252. Now, I know that 5252 sounds a bit random, but effectively that number equals to 1 horsepower in the calculations. I will release another video in the near future explaining torque versus horsepower in more detail, but for now, here's an analogy to help you understand. Trucks are able to pull massive weights. This is because they have massive strokes that produce a load of torque. But this results in low RPM, so they can't go very fast. If you apply the opposite to a motorcycle that has small strokes, this results in a faster engine. Motorcycles can apply a small amount of torque significantly faster than, say, a car or truck, meaning that they don't have as much pulling power, but they can go way faster. Motorcycle manufacturers could significantly increase the amount of torque their motorcycles have, but that will result in power that's uncontrollable for most people. Engines like these are reserved for MotoGP bikes. Although 600s are awesome, they're unfortunately coming to an end, as some of you may already be aware of the current market shift away from 600cc sport bikes. Honda are no longer producing their CBR 600RR, Suzuki are no longer producing their Gixxer 600, and Yamaha just announced their new class of middleweight, the R7, in place of the R6. The only manufacturers still building 600 sport bikes are Kawasaki with their ZX6R. Yamaha may be setting the stage for a new battleground with their 700cc sport bikes. We'll see how the consumers will react in the near future. Anyway, that'll do for this video. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this one and I found it interesting. Let us know what you think in the comments. As always, please subscribe, like and share and all the usual stuff. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next video.